Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 9 of our read along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Today, I'm in addition to talking about our book, I'm going to let you know about something special coming up. I'll let you know later on too, but if you want to tune in afterwards at around 5 o'clock, I'm going to be doing a live stream craft presentation on how to make a sugar scrub, which looks like a carrot. It doesn't taste like a carrot, but it is actually edible. It's just a sugar scrub. So it's like sugar, olive oil, and a couple of little good things. And so, yeah, if you want to tune in today at 5, it's a really simple little craft, but I think it's a fun thing. And actually, because it is sort of related to what we do, we are the Tea with Mark Twain group. I'm going to like a little outdoor tea party this weekend, and so I'm going to bring a couple party favors. And so, for anyone who's going to be at the weekend tea party, you might be getting one of these little sugar scrubs that are very springy and carrot-like. And so that's what's gonna be happening. Uh-oh, I just noticed I didn't drink my water in preparation for tea time. Hang on a second, let me just drink this down, sorry. Cheers, okay, water done. Let's go ahead and have some chamomile tea. Hello, good to see you, Judy. I don't know if did you see the carrot? If you wanna come in at 5-ish, let's see, today is Tuesday, so there's not another reading over in Bill's group today. But yeah, if you want to tune in around 5, it'll be there later also too. But I'm going to be doing a little craft this afternoon, like how to make a springtime carrot-like sugar scrub. So that'll be fun today at 5. Let's try this chamomile tea though. I always love chamomile tea. Such a beautiful golden color and so delicious. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a bit about what happened yesterday. I'll be honest, I do not remember the details, and that's why I like doing the recap before we get started. I do remember, though, that it ended kind of with a cliffhanger, and that I was really eager to keep reading to find out what'll happen today. So let's find out. Let's refresh ourselves together to find out what was going on in there. All right, so where we started, last week we had ended with Mark Twain saying he was going to go to Humboldt area, county, region in Nevada territory because he had heard that there were silver mines there. And so he goes with 3 other gentlemen and they go out starting in yesterday's chapter. With 4 people, himself, 2 young lawyers and a blacksmith who is 60 years of age. The blacksmith is named Mr. Ballou and the 2 lawyers are Oliphant and Claggett. And they go out to, tune in at 5 to find out what a sugar scrub is. It's made of sugar, it's natural stuff used to scrub your skin. So it's exfoliating and it's kind of relaxing and fun, but it's also the main reason I make it, it's extremely cute. So we'll talk about that more at 5. So he goes out to the Humboldt area with these 3 other gentlemen and they're looking for silver. And he talks a bit about, getting out there and how the water wasn't great, it was cold, they were sleeping with the dog, cute little anecdotes. Let's get to the silver mine. So they get out there. By the 15th day, they're entering Unionville in Humboldt County, it was a county, and they're looking around and he says that, Mark Twain says he's been hesitant to speak directly about it with his companions because he didn't want to sound foolish. Because it seems like, even though they talked about how easy it is to become wealthy out there and to find that silver, he doesn't want to sound foolish, like just thinking he's going to go out and find silver. But in his heart of hearts, he believes he's just going to find the mother lode of silver and become suddenly secretly wealthy. And so he was saying how one day the other gentlemen are out and he's like, he just sauntered carelessly and casually away from the rest of them. And he looked around and he was just digging around and just looking around and he saw a shiny stone. He's like, oh my goodness, this must be pure silver. This is like money in my hand. And he's just like so thrilled. And so then he goes and looks a little further and he looks in the water and he sees these glistening, shiny rocks. And they even look golden, and he's like, oh my God, we were looking for silver and we have managed to find gold. Like, this is even better. Like, oh, this is the best. And so he gets back to where the other gentlemen are and he's talking about stuff. And Mr. Ballou, the experienced miner, says, I don't know if this is going to be a real place where we're going to get wealthy. don't really know, just, it looks okay, but it doesn't look great. It doesn't look super promising. And Mark Twain is like, well, just suppose that we found a section that would yield this much money. Would you be excited then? And the guy's like, well, of course. He's like, all right, now that you got that in your mind, Mark Twain continues like, suppose you found a ledge that would yield like 3 times as much as that. Would you be excited then? And it's like, of course. What do you know? And so Mark Twain casually whips out the shiny rocks and he throws it out there for them to look at. And they look at it, and Baloo says basically, it looks like mica and granite, which isn't even worth 10 cents an acre. So basically worthless. And Mark Twain observes, all that glitters is not gold. And I thought this was actually really funny and astute, that Mr. Baloo says he could go further than that and lay it up that nothing that glitters is gold. And in that sense, what he meant was that gold in the native state is dull. It's dull looking. It doesn't shine with an ostentatious glitter. But like the rest of the world, I still go on underrating men of gold and glorifying men of mica. Commonplace human nature cannot rise above that. Well, that's a beautiful line. Okay, but yeah, so Mark Twain discovers the hard way that day that his dreams of wealth and like just finding gold nuggets and silver loads, like just in the, as he walks down the way, he was dreaming a little too big. So in chapter 29, they talk about, like, they did find some stones that do look like they have some silver in them. They're not, the easy money that Mark Twain had hoped to find, but it's silver that they can dig it out, and then they're going to need to have it sent somewhere else to have the ore separated from the stone. So it will cost some money too, and it'll take some time, but the money is there, the silver is there. They have to work for it though. So they're all excited. They think they're about to be millionaires, and they start digging and digging, and then it gets hard because the ground literally gets hard. Like, well, maybe we don't need the tunnel. Let's go the other way. Let's try blasting it out. Then let's try this other thing. Then let's try that thing. And then eventually they realize it's still too hard for them, and they decide, instead of actually doing the work of digging it out, maybe what they should do is sell other people rights, like sell them feet. Like, you can have this many feet to my my claim. And so he said, in a while, they owned feet in so many other people's claims. He had feet in 50 other mines that had never been molested by a shovel or scratched with a pick. So again, all of these potential mines that people like himself had come by and laid claim to, assured that, and hopeful that they would find gold in them, or silver, in them eventually. But all of these, so many of these plots of land were not actually cultivated and mined. And so it was the potential wealth without the work of realizing it. So chapter 30, some more talking about like just folks who believe themselves to be wealthy. So many of these people who don't even have the money to pay for a meal, but believe that the wealth and the riches are right around the corner, that it's just just have to dig a little further and it's going to be there. And in the meantime, they'll sell you some rights to the feet in their claim, in their mine, but but just for right now, they don't even have enough for a meal. And so it's an interesting system he talks about of the people who believe they have so much. Also, Mark Twain then continues in that last chapter we read yesterday that before leaving Carson, the secretary and I, so he and his brother, had purchased some feet from some Esmeralda stragglers. Esmeralda had been the previous another big silver mining area, like Gold Hill and like the Humboldt County that they were then in. And so he decides to go from Carson to Esmeralda. He buys a horse, he goes with Mr. Liu and another gentleman named Ollendorf, a Prussian, and they go on their way. And along the way, they stop in an area where it ends up flooding that evening. And so the area floods. And so he says, we remained cooped up 8 days and nights with a curious crew. Swearing, drinking, and card playing were the order of the day, and occasionally a fight was thrown in for variety. Dirt and vermin. But let us forget these features. Their profusion is simply inconceivable. It is better that they remain so. So, darn it, once again, he's not telling us the most terrible of the stories. Darn. But then he says, but there were these 2 men. However, this chapter is long enough. So Mark Twain made us wait for chapter 31, which fortunately we get a chance to read today. Today we're going to read 4 chapters, chapters 31 through 34. Also, just so you know, tomorrow is Cesar Chavez Day. It's a holiday in the city of San Diego, and so the libraries will all be closed. And so we will be taking a day off from our reading. We'll come back on Thursday with 4 more chapters. And I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. I hope we end with a cliffhanger today. We'll find out. I both want a cliffhanger so we have something to look forward to for Thursday, but not too much of a cliffhanger because we're waiting a whole extra day before we get to read it. So, All right, let's go in today with chapters 31 through 34 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 31. There were 2 men in the company who caused me particular discomfort. One was a little Swede, about 25 years old, who knew only one song, and he was forever singing it. By day, we were all crowded into one small, stifling bar room, and so there was no escaping this person's music. Through all the profanity, whiskey guzzling, old sledge, and quarreling, his monotonous song meandered with never a variation in its tiresome sameness, and it seemed to me, at last, that I would be content to die in order to be rid of the torture. The other man was a stalwart ruffian called Arkansas, who carried 2 revolvers in his belt and a bowie knife projecting from his boot, and who was always drunk and always suffering for a fight. But he was so feared that nobody would accommodate him. He would try all manner of little wary ruses to entrap somebody into an offensive remark, and his face would light up now and then when he fancied he was fairly on the scent of a fight. But invariably, his victim would elude his toils, and then he would show a disappointment that was almost pathetic. The landlord, Johnson, was a meek, well-meaning fellow, and Arkansas fastened on him early as a promising subject, and gave him no rest, day or night, for a while. On the 4th morning, Arkansas got drunk and sat himself down to wait for an opportunity. Presently, Johnson came in, just comfortably social with whiskey, and said, "I reckon the Pennsylvania election." Arkansas raised his finger impressively, and Johnson stopped. Arkansas rose unsteadily and confronted him. Said he, what do you know, about Pennsylvania? Answer me that. What do you know about Pennsylvania? I was only going to say. You was only going to say. You was only going to say. What was you going to say? That's it. That's what I want to know. I want to know what you know about Pennsylvania, since you're making yourself so damn free. Answer me that. Mr. Arkansas, if you'd only let me. Who's a hindering you? Don't you insinuate nothing agin me. Don't you do it. Don't you come in here bullying around and cussing and going on like a lunatic. Don't you do it, 'cause I won't stand it. If fight's what you want, out with it. I'm your man. Out with it," said Johnson, backing into a corner, Arkansas following menacingly. "Why, I never said nothing, Mr. Arkansas. You don't give a man no chance. I was only going to say that Pennsylvania was going to have an election next week. That was all. That was everything I was going to say. I wish I may never stir if it wasn't." "Well then, why didn't you say it? What did you come swelling around that way for and trying to raise trouble?" "Why, I didn't come swelling around, Mr. Arkansas. I'm a liar, am I? Great Caesar's ghost! Oh, please, Mr. Arkansas, I never meant such a thing as that. I wish I may die if I did. All the boys will tell you that I've always spoke well of you and respected you more than any man in the house. Ask Smith. Ain't it so, Smith? Didn't I say, no longer ago than last night, that for a man that was a gentleman all the time, and every way you took him, give me Arkansas? I'll leave it to any gentleman here if them weren't the very words I used. Come now, Mr. Arkansas, let's take a drink. Let's shake hands and take a drink. Come up, everybody. It's my treat. Come up, Bill, Tom, Bobby, Scotty, come up. I want you all to take a drink with me in Arkansas. Old Arkansas, I call him. Bully old Arkansas. Give me your hand again. Look at him, boys. Just take a look at him. Thar stands the whitest man in America, and the man that denies it has got to fight me, that's all. Give me that old flipper again. They embraced with drunken affection on the landlord's part and unresponsive toleration on the part of Arkansas, who, bribed by a drink, was disappointed of his prey once more. But the foolish landlord was so happy to have escaped butchery that he went on talking when he ought to have marched himself out of danger. The consequence was that Arkansas shortly began to glower upon him dangerously, and presently said, "Landlord, will you please make that remark over again, if you please?" "I was a-saying to Scotty that my father was upwards of 80-year-old when he died." "Was that all that you said?" "Yes, that was all." "Didn't say nothing but that?" "No, nothing." Then an uncomfortable silence. Arkansas played with his glass a moment, lolling on his elbows on the counter. Then he meditatively scratched his left shin with his right boot while the awkward silence continued. But presently he loafed away toward the stove, looking dissatisfied. Roughly shouldered 2 or 3 men out of a comfortable position, occupied it himself, gave a sleeping dog a kick that sent him howling under a bench, then spread his long legs and his blanket coat tails apart and proceeded to warm his back. In a little while he fell to grumbling to himself, and soon he slouched back to the bar and said, "Landlord, what's your idea for raking up old personalities and blowing about your father? Ain't this company agreeable to you? Ain't it? If this company ain't agreeable to you, perhaps we'd better leave. Is that your idea? Is that what you're coming at?" "Why, bless your soul, Arkansas, I weren't thinking of such a thing. My father and my mother—" "Landlord, don't crowd a man. Don't do it. If nothing'll do you but a disturbance, out with it like a man. But don't rake up old bygones and fling 'em in the teeth of a passel of people who wants to be peaceable if they could get a chance. What's the matter with you this morning anyway? I never see a man carry on so." "Arkansas, I really didn't mean no harm, and I won't go on with it if it's unpleasant to you. I reckon my liquor's got into my head, and what with the flood and having so many to feed and look out for." "So that's what's a rankling in your heart, is it? You want us to leave, do you? There's too many on us? You want us to pack up and swim. Is that it? Come." "Please be reasonable, Arkansas. Now you know that I ain't the man to—" "Are you a-threatening me? Are you? By George, the man don't live that can scare me. Don't you try to come that game, my chicken, 'cause I can stand a good deal, but I won't stand that. Come out from behind that bar till I clean you. You want to drive us out, do you, you sneaking, underhanded hound? Come out from behind that bar. I'll learn you to bully and badger and browbeat a gentleman that's forever trying to befriend you, and keep you out of trouble. Please, Arkansas, please don't shoot if there's got to be bloodshed. Do you hear that, gentleman? Do you hear him talk about bloodshed? So it's blood you want, is it, you raving desperado? You'd made up your mind to murder somebody this morning. I knowed it perfectly well. I'm the man, am I? It's me you're going to murder, is it? But you can't do it, thought I get one chance first. You thieving, black-hearted, white-livered son of a nigger. Draw your weapon. With that, Arkansas began to shoot, and the landlord to clamber over benches, men, and every sort of obstacle in a frantic desire to escape. In the midst of the wild hubbub, the landlord crashed through a glass door, and as Arkansas charged after him, the landlord's wife suddenly appeared in the doorway and confronted the desperado with a pair of scissors. Her fury was magnificent. With head erect and flashing eyes, she stood a moment and then advanced, with her weapon raised. The astonished ruffian hesitated and then fell back a step. She followed. She backed him step by step into the middle of the bar room, and then, while the wondering crowd closed up and gazed, she gave him such another tongue-lashing as never a cowed and shamefaced braggart got before, perhaps. As she finished and retired victorious, a roar of applause shook the house, and every man ordered drinks for the crowd in one and the same breath. The lesson was entirely sufficient. The reign of terror was over, and the Arkansas domination broken for good. During the rest of the season of island captivity, there was one man who sat apart in a state of permanent humiliation, never mixing in any quarrel or uttering a boast, and never resenting the insults the once cringing crew now constantly leveled at him. And that man was Arkansas. By the 5th or 6th morning, the waters had subsided from the land, but the stream in the old riverbed was still high and swift, and there was no possibility of crossing it. On the 8th, it was still too high for an entirely safe passage, but life in the inn had become next to insupportable by reason of the dirt, drunkenness, fighting, etc., and so we made an effort to get away. In the midst of a heavy snowstorm, we embarked in a canoe, taking our saddles aboard and towing our horses after us by their halters. The Prussian, Ollendorf, was in the bow with a paddle. Baloo paddled in the middle, and I sat in the stern holding the halters. When the horses lost their footing and began to swim, Ollendorf got frightened, for there was great danger that the horses would make our aim uncertain, and it was plain that if we failed to land at a certain spot, the current would throw us off and almost surely cast us into the main Carson, which was a boiling torrent now. Such a catastrophe would be death in all probability, for we would be swept to sea in the sink or overturned and drowned. We warned Ollendorf to keep his wits about him and handle himself carefully, but it was useless. The moment the bow touched the bank, he made a spring, and the canoe whirled upside down in 10-foot water. Ollendorf seized some brush and dragged himself ashore, but Baloo and I had to swim for it, encumbered with our overcoats. But we held on to the canoe, and although we were washed down nearly to the Carson, we managed to push the boat ashore and make a safe landing. We were cold and water-soaked, but safe. The horses made a landing too, but our saddles were gone, of course. We tied the animals in the sagebrush, and there they had to stay for 24 hours. We bailed out the canoe and ferried over some food and blankets for them, but we slept one more night in the inn before making another venture on our journey. The next morning it was still snowing furiously when we got away with our new stock of saddles and accoutrements. We mounted and started. The snow lay so deep on the ground that there was no sign of a road perceptible, and the snowfall was so thick that we could not see more than 100 yards ahead, else we could have guided our course by the mountain ranges. The case looked dubious, but Ollendorf said his instinct was as sensitive as any compass, and that he could strike a beeline for Carson City and never diverge from it. He said that if he were to straggle a single point out of the true line, his instinct would assail him like an outraged conscience. Consequently, we dropped into his wake happy and content. For half an hour we poked along warily enough, but at the end of that time we came upon a fresh trail, and Ollendorf shouted proudly, "I knew I was as dead certain as a compass, boys. Here we are, right in somebody's tracks that will hump the way for us without any trouble. Let's hurry up and join company with the party." So we put the horses into as much of a trot as the deep snow would allow, and before long it was evident that we were gaining on our predecessors, for the tracks grew more distinct. We hurried along, and at the end of an hour, the tracks looked still newer and fresher. But what surprised us was that the number of travelers in advance of us seemed to steadily increase. We wondered how so large a party came to be traveling at such a time and in such a solitude. Somebody suggested that it must be a company of soldiers from the fort, and so we accepted that solution and jogged along a little faster still, for they could not be far off now. But the tracks still multiplied, and we began to think the platoon of soldiers was miraculously expanding into a regiment. Baloo said they had already increased to 500. Presently, he stopped his horse and said, "Boys, these are our own tracks, and we've actually been circusing round and round in a circle for more than 2 hours out here in this blind desert. By George, this is perfectly hydraulic." Then the old man waxed wroth and abusive. He called Ollendorf all matter of hard names, said he never saw such a lurid fool as he was, and ended with the peculiarly venomous opinion that he did not know as much as a logarithm. We certainly had been following our own tracks. Ollendorf and his mental compass were in disgrace from that moment. After all our hard travel, here we were on the bank of the stream again, with the end beyond dimly outlined through the driving snowfall. While we were considering what to do, the young Swede landed from the canoe and took his pedestrian way Carsonwards, singing his same tiresome song about his sister and his brother, and the child in the grave with its mother, and in a short minute faded and disappeared in the white oblivion. He was never heard of again. He no doubt got bewildered and lost, and fatigue delivered him over to sleep, and sleep betrayed him to death. Possibly he followed our treacherous tracks till he became exhausted and dropped. Presently, the overland stage forded the now fast receding stream and started towards Carson on its first trip since the flood came. We hesitated no longer now, but took up our march in its wake and trotted merrily along, for we had good confidence in the driver's bump of locality. But our horses were no match for the fresh stage team. We were soon left out of sight, but it was no matter, for we had the deep ruts the wheels made for a guide. By this time it was 3 p.m, and consequently it was not very long before night came, and not with a lingering twilight, but with a sudden shutting down like a cellar door, as is its habit in that country. The snowfall was still as thick as ever, and of course we could not see 15 steps beyond us, or before us. But all about us the white glare of the snow bed enabled us to discern the smooth sugarloaf mounds made by the covered sage bushes, and just in front of us the 2 faint grooves which we knew were the steadily filling and slowly disappearing wheel tracks. Now, those sage bushes were all about the same height, 3 or 4 feet. They stood just about 7 feet apart, all over the vast desert. Each of them was a mere snow mound now. In any direction that you proceeded, the same as in a well-laid-out orchard, you would find yourself moving down a distinctly defined avenue with a row of these snow mounds on either side of it. An avenue, the customary width of a road, nice and level in its breadth, and rising at the sides in the most natural way by reason of the mounds. But we had not thought of this. Then imagine the chilly thrill that shot through us when it finally occurred to us, far in the night, that since the last faint trace of the wheel tracks had long ago been buried from sight, we might now be wandering down a mere sagebrush avenue, miles away from the road, and diverging farther and further and further away from it all the time. Having a cake of ice slip down one's back is placid comfort compared to it. There was a sudden leap and stir of blood that had been asleep for an hour, and a sudden arousing of all the drowsing activities in our minds and bodies. We were alive and awake at once, and shaking and quaking with consternation too. There was an instant halting and dismounting, a bending low, and an anxious scanning of the roadbed. Useless, of course, for if a faint depression could not be discerned from an altitude of 4 or 5 feet above it, it certainly could not with one's nose nearly against it. Chapter 32. We seemed to be in the road, but that was no proof. We tested this by walking off in various directions. The regular snow mounds and the regular avenues between them convinced each man that he had found the true road and that the others had found only false ones. Plainly, the situation was desperate. We were cold and stiff, and the horses were tired. We decided to build a sagebrush fire and camp out till morning. This was wise, because if we were wandering from the right road and the snowstorm continued another day, our case would be the next thing to hopeless if we kept on. All agreed that a campfire was what would come nearest to saving us now, and so we set about building it. We could find no matches, and so we tried to make shift with the pistols. Not a man in the party had ever tried to do such a thing before, but not a man in the party doubted that it could be done, and without any trouble, because every man in the party had read about it in books many a time and had naturally come to believe it with trusting simplicity, just as he had long ago accepted and believed that other common book fraud about Indians and lost hunters making a fire by rubbing 2 dry sticks together. We huddled together on our knees in the deep snow, and the horses put their noses together and bowed their patient heads over us, and while the feathery flakes eddied down and turned us into a group of white statuary, we proceeded with the momentous experiment. We broke twigs from a sage bush and piled them on a little cleared place in the shelter of our bodies. In the course of 10 or 15 minutes, all was ready, and then, while conversation ceased and our pulses beat low with anxious suspense, Ollendorf applied his revolver, pulled the trigger, and blew the pile clear out of the county. It was the flattest failure that ever was. This was distressing, but it paled before a greater horror. The horses were gone. I had been appointed to hold the bridles, but in my absorbing anxiety over the pistol experiment, I had unconsciously dropped them, and the released animals had walked off in the storm. It was useless to try to follow them, for their footfalls could make no sound, and one could pass within 2 yards of the creatures and never see them. We gave them up without an effort at recovering them, and cursed the lying books that said horses would stay by their masters for protection and companionship in a distressful time like ours. We were miserable enough before. We felt still more forlorn now. Patiently, but with blighted hope, we broke more sticks and piled them, and once more the Prussians shot them into annihilation. Plainly, to light a fire with a pistol was an art requiring practice and experience, and the middle of a desert at midnight in a snowstorm was not a good place or time for the acquiring of the accomplishment. We gave it up and tried the other. Each man took a couple of sticks and fell to chafing them together. At the end of half an hour, we were thoroughly chilled, and so were the sticks. We bitterly execrated the Indians, the hunters, and the books that had betrayed us with the silly device, and wondered dismally what was next to be done. At this critical moment, Mr. Ballou fished out 4 matches from the rubbish of an overlooked pocket. To have found 4 gold bars would have seemed poor and cheap good luck compared to this. One cannot think how good a match looks under such circumstances, or how lovable and precious and sacredly beautiful to the eye. This time we gathered sticks with high hopes, and when Mr. Ballou prepared to light the first match, there was an amount of interest centered upon him that pages of writing could not describe. The match burned hopefully for a moment, and then went out. It could not have carried more regret with it if it had been a human life. The next match simply flashed and died. The wind puffed the third out just as it was on the imminent verge of success. We gathered together closer than ever and developed a solicitude that was rapt and painful as Mr. Ballou scratched our last hope on his leg. It lit, burned blue and sickly, and then budded into a robust flame. Shading it with his hands, the old gentleman bent gradually down, and every heart went with him. Everybody, too, for that matter, and blood and breath stood still. The flame touched the sticks at last, took gradual hold upon them, hesitated, took a stronger hold, hesitated again, held its breath 5 heart-breaking seconds, then gave a sort of human gasp and went out. Nobody said a word for several minutes. It was a solemn sort of silence. Even the wind put on a stealthy, sinister quiet and made no more noise than the falling flakes of snow. Finally, a sad-voiced conversation began, and it was soon apparent that in each of our hearts lay the conviction that this was our last night with the living. I had so hoped that I was the only one who felt so. When the others calmly acknowledged their conviction, it sounded like the summons itself. Ollendorf said, "Brothers, let us die together, and let us go without one hard feeling towards each other. Let us forget and forgive bygones. I know that you have felt hard towards me for turning over the canoe and for knowing too much and leading you round and round in the snow. But I meant well. Forgive me. I acknowledge freely that I have had hard feelings against Mr. Ballou for abusing me and calling me a logarithm, which is a thing I do not know what, but no doubt a thing considered disgraceful and unbecoming in America, and it has scarcely been out of my mind and has hurt me a great deal. But let it go. I forgive Mr. Ballou with all my heart, and..." Poor Ollendorf broke down, and the tears came. He was not alone, for I was crying too, and so was Mr. Ballou. Ollendorf got his voice again and forgave me for things I had done and said. Then he got out his bottle of whiskey and said that whether he lived or died, he would never touch another drop. He said he had given up all hope of life, and although ill-prepared, was ready to submit humbly to his fate. That he wished he could be spared a little longer, not for any selfish reason, but to make a thorough reform in his character, and by devoting himself to helping the poor, nursing the sick, and devoting and pleading with the people to guard themselves against the evils of intemperance, make his life a beneficent example to the young, and lay it down at last with the precious reflection that it had not been lived in vain. He ended by saying that his reform should begin at this moment, even here in the presence of death, since no longer time was to be vouchsafed, wherein to prosecute it to men's help and benefit. And with that, he threw away the bottle of whiskey. Mr. Ballou made remarks of similar purport, and began the reform he could not live to continue by throwing away the ancient pack of cards that had solaced our captivity during the flood and made it bearable. He said he never gambled, but still was satisfied that the meddling with cards in any way was immoral and injurious, and no man could be wholly pure and blemishless without eschewing them. And therefore, continued he, in doing this act, I already feel more in sympathy with that spiritual saturnalia necessary to entire and obsolete reform. These rolling syllables touched him as no intelligible eloquence could have done, and the old man sobbed with a mournfulness not unmingled with satisfaction. My own remarks were of the same tenor as those of my comrades, and I know that the feelings that prompted them were heartfelt and sincere. We were all sincere, and all deeply moved and earnest, for we were in the presence of death and without hope. I threw away my pipe, and in doing it felt that at last I was free of a hated vice, and one that had ridden me like a tyrant all my days. While I yet talked, the thought of the good I might have done in the world, and the still greater good I might now do, with these new incentives and higher and better aims to guide me, if I could only be spared a few years longer, overcame me, and the tears came again. We put our arms about each other's necks and awaited the warning drowsiness that precedes death by freezing. It came stealing over us presently, and then we bade each other a last farewell. A delicious dreaminess wrought its web about my yielding senses, while the snowflakes wove a winding sheet about my conquered body. Oblivion came. The battle of life was done. Chapter 33. I do not know how long I was in a state of forgetfulness, but it seemed an age. A vague consciousness grew upon me by degrees, and then came a gathering anguish of pain in my limbs and through all my body. I shuddered. The thought flitted through my brain, this is death. This is the hereafter. Then came a white upheaval at my side, and a voice said, with bitterness, "Will some gentleman be so good as to kick me behind?" It was Ballou. At least it was a tousled snow image in a sitting posture, with Ballou's voice. I rose up, and there in the gray dawn, not 15 steps from us, were the frame buildings of a stage station, and under a shed stood our still saddled and bridled horses. An arched snowdrift broke up now, and Ollendorf emerged from it, and the three of us sat and stared at the houses without speaking a word. We really had nothing to say. We were like the profane man who could not do the subject justice. The whole situation was so painfully ridiculous and humiliating that words were tame, and we did not know where to commence anyhow. The joy in our hearts at our deliverance was poisoned, well nigh dissipated indeed. We presently began to grow pettish by degrees, and sullen, and then angry at each other, angry at ourselves, angry at everything in general. We moodily dusted the snow from our clothing, and in unsociable single file plowed our way to the horses, unsaddled them, and sought shelter in the station. I have scarcely exaggerated a detail of this curious and absurd adventure. It occurred almost exactly as I have stated it. We actually went into camp in a snowdrift in a desert, at midnight in a storm, forlorn and helpless, within 15 steps of a comfortable inn. For 2 hours we sat apart in the station and ruminated in disgust. The mystery was gone now, and it was plain enough why the horses had deserted us. Without a doubt, they were under that shed a quarter of a minute after they had left us, and they must have overheard and enjoyed all our confessions and lamentations. After breakfast we felt better, and the zest of life soon came back. The world looked bright again, and existence was as dear to us as ever. Presently an uneasiness came over me, grew upon me, assailed me without ceasing. Alas, my regeneration was not complete. I wanted to smoke. I resisted with all my strength, but the flesh was weak. I wandered away alone and wrestled with myself an hour. I recalled my promises of reform and preached to myself persuasively, upbraidingly, exhaustively. But it was all vain. I shortly found myself sneaking among the snowdrifts, hunting for my pipe. I discovered it after a considerable search and crept away to hide myself and enjoy it. I remained behind the barn a good while, asking myself how I would feel if my braver, stronger, truer companions should catch me in my degradation. At last, I lit the pipe, and no human being can feel meaner and baser than I did then. I was ashamed of being in my own pitiful company. Still dreading discovery, I felt that perhaps the further side of the barn would be somewhat safer, and so I turned the corner. As I turned the one corner, smoking, Ollendorf turned the other with his bottle to his lips, and between us sat unconscious Baloo, deep in a game of solitaire with the old greasy cards. Absurdity could go no farther. We shook hands and agreed to say no more about reform and examples to the rising generation. The station we were at was at the verge of the 26-mile desert. If we had approached it half an hour earlier the night before, we must have heard men shouting there and firing pistols, for they were expecting some sheep drovers in their flocks, and knew that they would infallibly get lost and wander out of reach of help unless guided by sounds. Excuse me. While we remained at the station, 3 of the drovers arrived, nearly exhausted with their wanderings, but 2 others of their party were never heard of afterwards. We reached Carson in due time and took a rest. This rest, together with preparations for the journey to Esmeralda, kept us there a week, and the delay gave us the opportunity to be present at the trial of the great landslide case of Hyde versus Morgan, an episode which is famous in Nevada to this day. After a word or two of necessary explanation, I will set down the history of this singular affair just as it transpired. Before we move to the next chapter, I want to share this drawing of the 3 reformed, not so reformed gentlemen, one with his bottle, one with his pipe, and one with his cards. Adorable. Okay, and today we will conclude with chapter 34 of Roughing It. Chapter 34. The mountains are very high and steep about Carson, Eagle, and Washoe valleys. Very high and very steep, and so when the snow gets to melting off fast in the spring and the warm surface earth begins to moisten and soften, the disastrous landslides commence. The reader cannot know what a landslide is unless he has lived in that country and seen the whole side of a mountain taken off some fine morning and deposited down in the valley, leaving a vast, treeless, unsightly scar upon the mountain's front to keep the circumstance fresh in his memory all the years that he may go on living within 70 miles of that place. General Buncombe was shipped out to Nevada in the invoice of territorial officers to be United States Attorney. He considered himself a lawyer of parts, and he very much wanted an opportunity to manifest it. Partly for the pure gratification of it, and partly because his salary was territorially meager, which is a strong expression. Now, the older citizens of the new territory look down upon the rest of the world with a calm, benevolent compassion, as long as it keeps out of the way. When it gets in the way, they snub it. Sometimes this latter takes the shape of a practical joke. One morning, Dick Hyde rode furiously up to General Buncombe's door in Carson City and rushed into his presence without stopping to tie his horse. He seemed much excited. He told the general that he wanted him to conduct a suit for him and would pay him $500 if he achieved a victory. And then, with violent gestures and a world of profanity, he poured out his griefs. He said it was pretty well known that for some years he had been farming, or ranching as the more customary term is, in Washoe District, and making a successful thing of it. And furthermore, it was known that his ranch was situated just in the edge of the valley, and that Tom Morgan owned a ranch immediately above it on the mountainside. And now the trouble was that one of those hated and dreaded landslides had come and slid Morgan's ranch, fences, cabin, barns, and everything down on top of his ranch, and exactly covered up every single vestige of his property to a depth of about 38 feet. Morgan was in possession and refused to vacate the premises, said he was occupying his own cabin and not interfering with anybody else's, and said the cabin was standing on the same dirt and same ranch it had always stood on, and he would like to see anybody make him vacate. And when I reminded him, said Hyde, weeping, that it was on top of my ranch and that he was trespassing, he had the infernal meanness to ask me why didn't I stay on my ranch and hold possession when I see him a-comin'? Why didn't I stay on it, the blathering lunatic? By George, when I heard that racket and looked up that hill, it was just like the whole world was a-rippin' and a-tearing down that mountainside. Splinters and cordwood, thunder and lightning, hail and snow, odds and ends of haystacks and awful clouds of dust. Trees going end over end in the air, rocks as big as a house jumping about 1,000 feet high and busting into 10 million pieces. Cattle turned inside out and a-comin' head on with their tails hanging out between their teeth. And in the midst of all that rack and destruction sat that cussed Morgan on his gatepost, a-wonderin' why I didn't stay and hold possession. Laws, bless me, I just took one glimpse, General, and lit out in the county in 3 jumps exactly. But what grinds me is that Morgan hangs on there and won't move off in that ranch. Says it's his'n and he's going to keep it. Likes it better'n he did when it was higher up the hill. Mad! Well, I've been so mad for 2 days I couldn't find my way to town. Been wandering around in the brush in a starving condition. Got anything here to drink, General? But I'm here now, and I'm a-goin' to law. You hear me? Never in all the world, perhaps, were a man's feelings so outraged as were the General's. He said he had never heard of such high-handed conduct in all his life as this Morgan's. And he said there was no use in going into law. Morgan had no shadow of right to remain where he was. Nobody in the wide world would uphold him in it, and no lawyer would take his case, and no judge listen to it. Hyde said that right there was where he was mistaken. Everybody in town sustained Morgan. Hal Brayton, a very smart lawyer, had taken his case. The courts being in vacation, it was to be tried before a referee, and ex-Governor Roop had already been appointed to that office and would open his court in a large public hall near the hotel at 2 that afternoon. The General was amazed. He said he had suspected before that the people of that territory were fools, and now he knew it. But he said rest easy and collect the witnesses, for the victory was just as certain as if the conflict were already over. Hyde wiped away his tears and left. At 2 in the afternoon, Referee Roop's court opened, and Roop appeared throned among his sheriffs, the witnesses, and spectators, and wearing upon his face a solemnity so awe-inspiring that some of his fellow conspirators had misgivings that maybe he had not comprehended, after all, that this was merely a joke. An unearthly stillness prevailed, for at the slightest noise the judge uttered sternly the command, "Order in the court," and the sheriffs promptly echoed it. Presently the General elbowed his way through the crowd of spectators with his arms full of law books, and on his ears fell an order from the judge which was the first respectful recognition of his high official dignity that had ever saluted them, and it trickled presently through his whole system. "Way for the United States Attorney." The witnesses were called. Legislators, high government officers, ranchmen, miners, Indians, Chinamen, Negroes. 3/4 of them were called by the defendant Morgan, but no matter, their testimony invariably went in favor of the plaintiff Hyde. Each new witness only added new testimony to the absurdity of a man's claiming to own another man's property because his farm had slid down on top of it. Then the Morgan lawyers made their speeches and seemed to make singularly weak ones. They did really nothing to help the Morgan cause. And now the General, with exultation in his face, got up and made an impassioned effort. He pounded the table, he banged the law books, he shouted and roared and howled. He quoted from everything and everybody: poetry, sarcasm, statistics, history, pathos, bathos, blasphemy, and wound up with a grand war whoop for free speech, freedom of the press, free schools, the glorious bird of America, and the principles of eternal justice. Applause. When the General sat down, he did it with the conviction that if there was anything in good, strong testimony, a great speech, and believing and admiring countenances all around, Mr. Morgan's case was killed. Ex-Governor Roop leant his head upon his hand for some minutes, thinking, and the still audience waited for his decision. Then he got up and stood erect, with bended head, and thought again. Then he walked the floor with long, deliberate strides, his chin in his hand, and still the audience waited. At last he returned to his throne, seated himself, and began impressively. Gentlemen, I feel the great responsibility that rests upon me this day. This is no ordinary case. On the contrary, it is plain that it is the most solemn and awful that ever man was called upon to decide. Gentlemen, I have listened attentively to the evidence and have perceived that the weight of it, the overwhelming weight of it, is in favor of the plaintiff Hyde. I have listened also to the remarks of counsel with high interest, and especially will I commend the masterly and irrefutable logic of the distinguished gentleman who represents the plaintiff. But, gentlemen, let us beware how we allow mere human testimony, human ingenuity in argument, and human ideas of equity to influence us at a moment so solemn as this. Gentlemen, it ill becomes us, worms as we are, to meddle with the decrees of heaven. It is plain to me that heaven, in its inscrutable wisdom, has seen fit to move this defendant's ranch for a purpose. We are but creatures, and we must submit. If heaven has chosen to favor the defendant Morgan in this marked and wonderful manner, and if heaven, dissatisfied with the position of the Morgan ranch upon the mountainside, has chosen to remove it to a position more eligible and more advantageous for its owner, it ill becomes us, insects as we are, to question the legality of the act or inquire into the reasons that prompted it. No, heaven created the ranches, and it is heaven's prerogative to rearrange them, to experiment with them, to shift them around at its pleasure. It is for us to submit without repining. I warn you that this thing which has happened is a thing with which the sacrilegious hands and brains and tongues of men must not meddle. Gentlemen, it is the verdict of this court that the plaintiff, Richard Hyde, has been deprived of his ranch by the visitation of God, and from this decision there is no appeal. Buncombe seized his cargo of law books and plunged out of the courtroom, frantic with indignation. He pronounced Roop to be a miraculous fool, an inspired idiot. In all good faith, he returned at night and remonstrated with Roop upon his extravagant decision, and implored him to walk the floor and think for half an hour, and see if he could not figure out some sort of modification of the verdict. Roop yielded at last and got up to walk. He walked 2 hours and a half, and at last his face lit up happily, and he told Buncombe it had occurred to him that the ranch underneath the New Morgan Ranch still belonged to Mr. Hyde, that his title to the ground was just as good as it had ever been, and therefore he was of opinion that Hyde had a right to dig it out from under there, and... The general never waited to hear the end of it. He was always an impatient and irascible man, they say. At the end of 2 months, the fact that he had been played upon with a joke had managed to bore itself, like another Hoosac tunnel, through the solid adamant of his understanding. That concludes today's chapter. I just want to show you the picture that they drew of the ranch sliding down, the Morgan Ranch sliding down to cover the Hyde Ranch. It's a good drawing. It's a good concept too. That concludes today's reading. As I mentioned at the start, tomorrow we do have it's a holiday. It's Cesar Chavez Day, and so there will not be a reading tomorrow. I hope you'll come back on Thursday as we find out some more of what's going on in Roughing It. And if you'd like to tune in today at 5, I will be demonstrating how to make these little springtime carrot-shaped sugar scrubs. So join me today. That'll be both on the San Diego Public Library's virtual hub and on the Pacific Beach Library's page. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you back on Thursday. Take care, friends. Bye.